Joint employer status is a legal concept that determines whether more than one company can be considered the employer of a worker at the same time. This idea becomes particularly important in industries where large corporations rely heavily on staffing agencies, subcontractors, or franchisees to perform essential parts of their business operations. In such arrangements, the smaller contractor may handle the payroll and the day-to-day employment paperwork, but the larger company often sets the standards, policies, and expectations that shape the employee's actual working environment. The concept exists to address the gap that arises when responsibility is divided between two entities, but workers still need clear protections. For example, a staffing agency may technically employ a worker, but the worker's tasks, schedules, and performance targets may be dictated by the larger corporation that benefits from their labor. In such cases, joint employer status provides a way to hold both the contractor and the bigger company accountable for issues such as wages, working hours, discrimination, or safety violations. Without this framework, employees could fall into a gray area where neither party takes full responsibility for their rights. The principle is not just theoretical, it has real-world implications for millions of workers who find themselves in situations where their formal employer has little power to improve their conditions, while the company that actually controls their work avoids liability. Joint employer status is meant to ensure that the company exercising real influence cannot simply pass the blame onto a smaller contractor. It aims to close loopholes that leave workers vulnerable while recognizing the practical realities of modern employment structures where corporate control often extends far beyond the boundaries of direct employment contracts. The question of liability for big companies arises because, in many cases, they do more than simply contract out work. They establish the conditions under which that work is performed. Even when a contractor is officially the employer on paper, the larger corporation often dictates policies, sets performance standards, and enforces rules that affect the daily reality of workers' jobs. For instance, a warehouse worker may technically be employed by a staffing agency, but the schedules, productivity requirements, and even safety protocols are designed and overseen by the multinational company that owns the facility. In such scenarios, it becomes difficult to argue that the big company has no responsibility for what happens inside that workplace. This is why courts and labor boards examine the level of control a large corporation exercises when deciding if joint employer status applies. If the company influences hiring and firing decisions, dictates work processes, or monitors employee performance closely, it is often seen as more than a distant business partner. Even indirect control, such as reserving the right to approve policies or vetoing contractor decisions, can point toward shared liability. The idea is that with power comes responsibility, and a company that benefits from labor while shaping the conditions under which it is carried out should not be allowed to escape accountability. The liability question is not just about fairness to workers but also about balance in the labor market. If large corporations can shield themselves entirely by using contractors, smaller employers end up shouldering the risks and obligations alone, even though they may have little real authority to change conditions. Recognizing joint employer status helps ensure that responsibility is distributed according to influence, holding the true decision-makers accountable for the outcomes of the workplaces they control. In the United States, the debate over joint employer status has been particularly intense, with rules shifting back and forth depending on regulatory changes and political leadership. The National Labor Relations Board has played a central role in shaping how the standard is applied, sometimes requiring evidence of direct and immediate control, and at other times adopting a broader view that includes indirect or even reserved control. Under the narrower standard, a big company would only be considered a joint employer if it was directly involved in actions such as hiring, firing, disciplining, or supervising workers on a daily basis. This approach limited liability for larger corporations and gave them more flexibility in using contractors or staffing agencies without fear of being held responsible for workplace issues. However, when the broader interpretation was introduced, the scope of potential liability widened significantly. Even if a company did not directly manage workers, the fact that it could influence policies, establish performance standards, or reserve the right to intervene was enough to bring it under the definition of a joint employer. This shift caused major concern among businesses, particularly in industries like hospitality, retail, and logistics, where contractors and franchise models are common. Large corporations feared increased exposure to lawsuits, higher compliance costs, and greater obligations to bargain collectively with workers they did not directly employ. For workers, these changes represented a chance to gain stronger protections and hold the companies that actually controlled their working conditions accountable. The back-and-forth nature of the rules, however, has left both workers and businesses in a state of uncertainty. Each shift in policy has created new expectations, only to be rolled back or redefined with a change in leadership, making joint employer status one of the most contested areas in modern labor law. For workers, the recognition of joint employer status can make the difference between limited recourse and meaningful protection. When a large corporation is acknowledged as a joint employer, employees gain the ability to hold that company accountable for violations of wage laws, unsafe working conditions, or unfair labor practices. This means that instead of relying solely on smaller contractors, who may lack the resources or authority to address systemic issues, workers can pursue remedies from the bigger company that actually has the power to make changes. It also opens the door to stronger collective bargaining, since unions can negotiate directly with the entity that truly sets the standards for working conditions, rather than being restricted to dealing with an intermediary. Beyond legal protection, joint employer recognition sends a signal of fairness. Workers often feel frustrated when they see large corporations dictating strict schedules, productivity goals, or workplace policies, yet disclaiming responsibility for the consequences. Holding these companies accountable restores balance by ensuring that responsibility follows control. It prevents scenarios where corporations reap the benefits of labor while avoiding the obligations that come with being an employer. For employees, this can mean more consistent enforcement of labor standards, better safety protections, and a greater sense of security knowing that the entity with real influence cannot simply walk away from accountability. For vulnerable groups, such as temporary or low-wage workers, the recognition of joint employer status can be especially significant. These workers are often the ones most affected by exploitative arrangements, where contractors act as a shield for bigger companies. By extending accountability to those at the top, the law helps close loopholes that would otherwise leave some of the most at-risk employees without meaningful recourse or protection in the workplace. For businesses, the possibility of being classified as a joint employer creates significant challenges and risks. Large corporations that rely heavily on contractors, staffing agencies, or franchise networks worry that joint liability could expose them to lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and collective bargaining obligations that were previously limited to the direct employer. This increased responsibility may translate into higher compliance costs, as companies would need to invest more in monitoring workplace practices, ensuring safety standards, and overseeing wage compliance across contractor-operated sites. For many corporations, the attraction of outsourcing lies in flexibility and reduced liability, and joint employer rules can undermine those advantages. Another concern is the loss of control over business strategy. If companies can be held liable for workplaces they do not directly manage, they may feel pressured to exercise stricter oversight over contractors to protect themselves from legal exposure. Ironically, this can reduce the independence of smaller contractors and shift more power back to the larger corporation, creating a situation where both sides struggle with blurred boundaries. Businesses argue that this could discourage partnerships, slow down operations, and increase costs in industries where outsourcing and franchising have long been standard models of growth. The uncertainty of shifting legal standards adds to the burden. Companies must constantly adapt their policies to align with the current definition of joint employer status, which has changed multiple times in recent years. This unpredictability makes it harder to plan long-term labor strategies and creates tension between maintaining efficiency and avoiding liability. From the perspective of businesses, joint employer status can feel like a moving target, one that complicates relationships with contractors and raises questions about where responsibility truly begins and ends in complex employment structures. The debate over joint employer status highlights a larger issue about fairness and responsibility in the modern economy. As companies expand and industries evolve, the line between who employs a worker and who controls their working conditions has become increasingly blurred. Joint employer rules attempt to bridge this gap by ensuring that accountability rests not only with the smaller contractor who processes payroll, but also with the larger corporation that often dictates the terms of the job. This balance is critical, because without it, workers risk falling into a legal gray area where their rights are harder to enforce and their protections weaker. The ongoing discussion is not simply about technical definitions of employment but about the values that guide labor policy. Should the law allow large corporations to avoid liability by outsourcing key operations, even when they exert influence over those workers' schedules, wages, and safety? Or should the law prioritize workers' ability to hold the true power holders accountable, regardless of how employment contracts are structured? These are the questions that labor boards, courts, and lawmakers continue to wrestle with, and their answers will shape the future of employment relationships for decades to come. Globally, the debate also reflects different economic models. In some countries, the emphasis is on protecting workers through expansive labor protections that make joint employer recognition more likely, while in others, the focus is on supporting business flexibility by limiting liability. This contrast shows that the issue is not only legal but also cultural and political. Joint employer status is a lens through which society decides how to distribute responsibility in increasingly complex employment systems, balancing the needs of workers seeking protection with the concerns of businesses striving for efficiency and growth. At its core, the question of joint employer status is about accountability. If a company benefits from labor and exerts control over how that labor is carried out, then responsibility must follow. Workers deserve protection, businesses need clarity, and the law must ensure that fairness is not lost in the spaces between contracts. Because in the end, responsibility should rest where the power truly lies.